So let's continue going through our functions here and kind of working through everything step by step to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page and getting going with the same things. So we've already completed the prepend function, which basically takes a new node that we might build and appends it to the front of the list. And we basically do this by taking our new node, which might be this guy that we're adding here, pointing its next pointer at whatever head's pointing at, and then pointing the head back at this new node in order to make sure everything's in the right place. So for instance, if you wanted to visualize that, that would be something with just doing a couple real quick pointer swaps, right? So for instance, if we were doing new node, we would create our new node, and then we would say new node set next, so that sets the next pointer to point at whatever head's pointing at, right? So we would basically do a quick little fix up here. So new node would now point at whatever head's pointing at, and then we would go ahead and say head equals new node, right? So that would basically erase this line and then go ahead and add this line down here, right? Thereby fixing up the list correctly and putting everything in its correct spot. Now what we're going to work on doing is basically work on doing the append function, which is doing the same thing, but instead of placing it at the front of the list, we're going to place it at the back of the list, which again is a pretty straightforward operation considering we have this nice little tail pointer that's always pointing to the last thing in the list. If we didn't have that, then we would have to traverse the list link by link to find out where the last one is, but with this guy we can just use tail directly. So visually, what do we need to do here to make this all work? Right, visually it should be pretty straightforward. What we need to do, we need to point whatever tail is pointing at and point it at our new node, right? So we need to draw an arrow down here, and then we basically need to make tail point at that new node, which will then have everything in its correct order, right? So the continuation of the list is always solid, and we always have our tail pointing to the actual last element in the list, right? And to do that in code will be in a very similar fashion to how we went about working with our prepend function. So the first thing we need to do is basically make that new node, or make a node for the data we want to add into the list. So we make a pointer, and then we go ahead and say make a new node of type T. Remember, T will be replaced at compile time with whatever the data type actually is that we're using. All right, so we create a new node which contains our data. After we've done that, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the list is empty. So if head is equal to null, right, then we just want to set head equal to our new node as well as tail equal to our new node. All right, that is just to make sure that if there's only one node in the list, then both head and tail should be pointing at that same node. Otherwise, if the list isn't empty, then what we can do is go ahead and create these little list fix-ups that we had looked at before, right? So what's the first thing we said we needed to do? The first thing we needed to do over here was basically point whatever tail is pointing at and point it at the new node that we just created. So to do that, we can just do tail set next and then put new node as its parameter, right? So that points tail at our new node. Right? I'm sorry, that points the node that tail is pointing at the new node that we just created. After that, we go ahead and then move tail to point at that new node that we just added, right? So to do that, we would do tail equals new node. All right, so now we go ahead and we have that next link put in there as well. However, we're going to run into one little issue here. And basically that little issue is, what should the previous pointer be pointing at? Right now, this could be pointing at basically nothing. So if we traversed the list from front to back, we would be all right, because all of those links are correct. But if we try to traverse the list in reverse order, this is going to break because we have no idea what this pointer is pointing at. So in order to fix that, we need to kind of look at our order of operations. So right now we have no way to directly access this node that the previous pointer should point at. So before we set tail equal to new node, we can basically go ahead and say new node arrow set prev equal to tail, right? So when we do that, before we actually adjust this pointer, now we can create our reverse link back to the thing that tail is pointing at, and then we can move this arrow so that tail is pointing at the last element in our list, right? So you have to remember order of operations is very important when we're going about mixing and matching and kind of fixing up these pointers, right? If we did these 3 lines in a different order, things may not necessarily work very well because we've broken links that we may have needed access to, right? So pay attention to the order that you're doing things in, right? So in theory, that should basically do our append and prepend functions. If I wanted to test that, I could try to build the code really quickly, right? So the code builds. If we run it, what I call it, ./dll.out, and feed it our command file, you can basically see that some of the functionality is broken, but we are indeed building a list, right? And our list is being constructed correctly. 3, 2, 1, 4, 5, 6, which I think is the order that we inserted nodes into. Or we may have been doing some appends and prepends, but this looks correct to me. Right, so back to our actual order that we kind of do things in when we're doing our assignments. We just completed a function, we compiled it, we tested it, things look right. So in order to remember to record that you've completed this function, we need to add it back into the Git repository and then commit it back to GitHub. So to do that, again, we do git add dll.hpp. We do git commit with a -m, and then we basically say completed the append function. And then after we've added it into the Git repository, we need to push it back to GitHub. So then we can do git push to push it to the actual GitHub repository, which if I come over here and refresh the page, you can see that our code was updated with completed the append function and the lines that were added into the file.